Everyone, I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to Dr. Jenny van der A's talk on Jan Blommaert's powerful voice. Many of you will know that Dr. Jenny van der A is a senior researcher and linguistic anthropologist at the Universities of Kampen and Leuven, where she's involved with projects covering topics such as informal learning, church practice, and the poetics of integration. Her most recent work deals with ethnographies of poverty and integration, and that will be published by Palgrave-MacMillan in the spring. In this short monologue today, this 30-minute monologue, Jenny, as Jan's long-term collaborator in different roles as student, colleague, and friend, reflects on the intricacies of the mentor-mentee relationships in academia, and she crafts a space here and shares it with us in which trust, intimacy, role play, and generosity are carefully examined. And ultimately, what she presents to us today lays bare structures of power and allows us to analyze that together. So thank you for coming and welcome. Welcome, Jenny. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to have you with us today, speaking for the Practices Research Network, and to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much. Can you see me well?
Yes, Jenny.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes?
Yes, we can. Yes. Can you hear us?
Sorry, I still had it on mute. Can you repeat that, Áine?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So that was an introduction by the Wingless Angels called Bright Soul, something Jan's favorite Nyabinghi song. Nyabinghi is a revolutionary rhythm that is played in reggae. Jan was a big reggae fan and will listen to reggae throughout this session. I'm going to start with the first part of this presentation called the working paper. Let me get to the right slide. Dear Jan, dear Jan, I have decided to write a bit about our life. Too bad you can't witness it anymore. Last year, my academic life was seriously disrupted by your passing on January 7, 2021. I often wonder where you are now. Are you dining with Bourdieu or Foucault somewhere? Or is there nothing left to experience after this earthly existence? Only you know. When I heard the news, Jan, of your expected death, I actually collapsed immediately. That didn't clear up until much later in 2021. I could no longer call or app. I had lost, as you once put it, my escape route. How much the loss affected me, no one could accurately assess. People went on with their lives, with their academic trajectory, and I stopped. I didn't understand that. I didn't want to understand that. In February of last year, I collapsed with all the consequences. In the summer, I read your last book, actually an essay, beautifully published by comrade Ikomali. And then I realized that I had to find the strength to go at it again, that I had to teach and do research the way you had described it so beautifully. Research as teamwork, teaching as inspiring. Research as teamwork and teaching as inspiring. I also realized that then, like you, I would collide with different conventions. That happened as well. In one place, I tried to teach gender studies from a Marxist perspective. Elsewhere, I was the libero who often coached my PhD candidate invisibly from the shadows. And yet I have no regrets about what I did. After all, I speak not to power, but in defiance of power, as you so beautifully put it in Dokwerker's excellent documentary about your life, which can still be viewed on YouTube. Jan, I now discuss in your style some lines of life that urgently need to be continued with your inspiration as an example. I base these on our interview, the last interview you gave while alive, on themes close to your heart, teaching, research, and activism. And I will treat them in that order. 1, teaching. We have an urgent need for research that deals with the figure of the teacher as a bridging figure in language and education. You belong to a generation of teachers who strongly believed in a kind of humanism in education. And so you started teaching because you loved people. You loved the students in front of you and you genuinely cared about them. And in that sense, for you, teaching and all the activities that go with it, such as tutoring, were all about giving. It's all about the other person. It's all about the students. So you are a good teacher if students basically learn from you. You are not a good teacher if you manage to produce extremely sophisticated PowerPoints or brilliant prose and so on. No, you are a good teacher if your students learn something from you. And we have to adapt to students. The opposite is never true. We have to adapt to students. Or at least you used to tell your students in the first lecture of the year that you would aim an inch above their heads, and they had to stretch a little bit to fill that gap. So you have to elevate yourself a little bit to be with them, and that's what students have to do. But it all starts from a basic human altruism, where you see your duty, the calling, that brings you to the classroom and makes you give to others that which you have to give. And it's also that altruism that creates quality control or a certain rigor when it comes to quality. You have to be demanding. When you give things, it has to be good stuff. It has to be the best you have. So don't underestimate your students. Make sure they stretch a little bit, but while you're doing that, give them the very best you have. Don't give them the science that was relevant 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Give them the science that is relevant now. 2, on research. You indicated in your interview that the most important theme for you was informal learning. Informal learning. You have learning that is organized through schools and other very recognizable organizations and institutions. But of course, again, all this new technology is coming around the corner. There is a new learning environment that could support the learning environment in schools, but which is very often seen as negative, as a kind of enemy of learning. If children play video games, in which they write a lot actually, have you ever noticed how much your children write to their classmates when they are playing video games or when they're active on their smartphones? This is often seen by mom and dad as anti-learning, while they actually learn a lot. And it is precisely the interaction between formal and informal learning that you have always emphasized in all kinds of ways. One example, new technologies like smartphones have also brought new forms of literacy into our societies. Traditionally, literacy is something that is acquired from the top down, you know. So your generation, Jan, older people, to which I almost belong myself by now, were basically the agents of literacy in that time, teaching the younger generation how to become literate. All these new technologies have now turned that around. We have to learn from the younger generation how these new forms of literacy work. And here's the interesting thing. Most of these literacies For example, how to be successful on Instagram have to be acquired informally in an extremely dense and extremely organized informal learning environment. So they have learning opportunities that we often overlook when we look at younger people's learning levels or the things that they're good at. You would have learned that from Günter Kress, the late Günter Kress, to consider learning as everything that we acquire, really everything, to consider learning as everything that we acquire in terms of knowledge and skills throughout life, including the bad things. So that's all learning, and it's the fundamental processes of learning that are changing now. And we need to look at that. 3, activism. Activism has become a dirty word, and especially an activist academic from a number of political positions in society is the ultimate enemy. An academic from a number of political positions is the ultimate enemy. So an academic intellectual who also has a political range of views, ideas, and principles, they are made active, hence the word activist. In your life, when you doubted the importance of what you were doing academically, and that happened quite often, the answer was provided by your activism. And that answer was because they needed it. These activists, unionists, but also school teachers, you spent your life lecturing to non-academic audiences, ranging from unions to individuals and organizations across the social spectrum, and you were everywhere. You were literally everywhere. You also wrote 15 little books in Dutch, for which, of course, you never received any academic recognition. But they were vulgarized booklets that were used in unions, continuing education programs, and so on. So the activists were also your audience, and they told you that your academic work was valuable. The activists told you that your academic work was valuable. They told you to keep going. They told you to do more. They asked you questions that then became priorities in research for you. And in that sense, it's basically your activism that kept you alive as an academic. Because we all have a question about relevance. Are we relevant as academics? Your academic bosses will never give you a clear answer because you have to write an evaluation every year and there are non-stop quality reviews. So you don't get the answer there. You get it in society at large. So the bottom line is, to finish this first part, no politician will ever answer your question about whether they are relevant. They are misplaced for that. Don't worry about what they say. Just go on being activists. You learn a tremendous amount outside the gates of the university. You learn a lot by talking to teachers, social workers, police officers, and so on. You learn a lot. And don't just do it in the context of fieldwork, do it in the context of daily life. Don't do it just in the context of fieldwork, do it in the context of daily life. Lovely Jan. Lovely Jan. I will continue to teach and research as I really only know in one way, your way, and may our voice therein resonate in the caverns of society, the margins of existence, the places where you so often and so gladly lingered. Dear Jan, I'm going to bring a dub poem now for you on a rhythm called Guyanese Dub, Reggae for Rodney by Linton Kwesi Johnson. Dear Jan, this is one for you. You don't see how the clouds, them just come sit upon me dream. Sit upon me dream like a dark silk screen. A dark silk screen over the vision I had seen. The vision I had seen. The vision I had seen. So I say that young Blommaert was a victim of disease. Someone says that he's gone through heaven in peace. Another says that young Blommaert shouldn't take up his true weight and go carry it on his back like a weary rock. But look how the Clyde just come sit upon me dream. He sit upon me dream like a shout or a scream. A shout or a scream or a really pretty scene when young Blommaert spoke and the people they come in. So I say that young Blommaert was a prisoner of fate. Someone says that he's gone through the hero's gate. Someone says that young Blommaert couldn't take his true weight, so he took it off his back and wear an anorak, and the raincoat it had dropped, the fedora pushed back. But look how my dream just get blown to smithereen. Blown to smithereen in the middle of the dream. The middle of the dream before the people them come in. When young Blommaert smoke, the people they come in. So I say that young Blommaert was no shark for the sea, and all that he wanted was to set the people free. With the workers and the teachers, he would cooperate, but like a fish to the hook, he got struck by Cancer Bay. You know, see how my dream just come blown to smithereen in the middle of the dream. The middle of the dream before the really crucial scene when the people they come in. So, I say that young Blommaert was no shark for the sea, and all that he wanted was to set the people free. With the workers and the teachers, he would cooperate, but like a fish to the hook, he got struck by cancer bait. You know, see how my dream come just get blown to smithereen, and blown to smithereen in the middle of the dream. The middle of the dream before the really crucial scene when the people then come in. Third part. The cigarettes. We've had a working paper, we've had a dub poem, and now it's the cigarettes. You blew smoke. You blew smoke. You blew one hell of a smoke. That's what you did. Blew in the faces of many. I had learned to appreciate the 30-minute ride from Turnhout to Tilburg, puffing away 10 sickies or more. By the time we got to Tilburg and could barely see each other, our words had resonated across the agrarian fields between Turnhout and Tilburg. Ideas about a better world, a better humanity, holding hands in super diversity. Polycentricity, African authors and books, Kent Mental. Jen, can you go and buy me some? Here is 50 euros. You think that's enough for a couple of packs? Hastily, I ran to the supermarket at the outer corner of the university premises. Without smoke, no words, and words were important. To lavish myself in order to write that PhD at all. What a dark day that was, dark and deep. The land was shattering as they took away our desks in the smoking booth, where we had so dutifully and diligently shared our thoughts on Caribbean school children, hidden away in a post-colonial context, hidden from the world in a parish behind God's back. God, not a topic you wanted to talk about very often. You were an atheist, you said, but you respected and researched them, those with the headscarves, who had all the right and the beauty, oh, the female beauty, to wear the headscarves. For hours on end, you would transcribe, comment on, retranscribe, omit, add, recenter their stories, only to say that in all right, they could wear the headscarves. Politics, racial inequality, all but not to talk about God. But where are you now? Where are you now? Jan, it was raining. You didn't feel well. You had a sore throat, you said, while smoking and sweating heavily. Your raincoat and rimmed hat, more a fedora really, resonated with the colorful scarf that beautifully adorned your character head. You told me you wish you could put yourself full of drugs and write endlessly, vigorously to finish everything you wanted to say, still say. Many lines were drawn, many more to be finished. We were walking, then standing, smoking, walking, running, and finally standing in the pouring rain, waiting for your taxi to come to bring you home. The corner of the Dante building at Tilburg University, we were standing, smoking, running, standing. A place you changed so profoundly, nothing's left of it anymore now that you have left. I wanted to hold you there, Jan, in the rain and tell you that everything would be okay. But in my heart, I knew it was not going to be that way, not the way I wanted it to be. There you stood, a monument, a mastodont. Linguistic anthropology itself, ResearchGate, our paper skyrocketed and my impact rose higher than the sky. But then you told me the thing, and I knew, I felt it long time coming, and how you were torn, and how you made the bill of your life in less than 20 minutes, and how the monument was demolished in the middle of the dream when the people, they come in. Let's listen to one final song that I would like to play for Jan. Very short one, actually. Let me see where you guys are at. Yep. Let's listen to The International.
Arise, you toilers of all age, again to misery and woe, to hell with humbleness and rage, give deadly battle to the foe, to declare and strong pride, and the last I kept on faith. This is international, unites and human race.
Thank you so much.
Jenny, thank you so much. Thank you for that really fabulously engaging, unique presentation. Really poignant and really powerful. Yeah, I'm absolutely. It's really revitalizing to be able to engage in that. To hear that, I think that lots of people are clapping their hands, and I think lots of people are going to have questions and comments for you. It was truly moving, truly original, just wonderful. There's some. You started by talking about approaches to teaching and research, which I found really emboldening. You know, so often we think, or the implication is that to move from teaching away from teaching to research is a mark of transcendence, but actually what you presented was the idea that what's transcendental is to approach both the teaching and learning space and research in the same way. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think we all sort of sometimes think like, oh no, we have to teach again. But for Jan, teaching was always extremely important. You know, it was instilling in the students a sort of appreciation, a sort of getting along with the material, to sort of savor the material. And when I was 19, I sent a letter to the anthropologist Del Hymes, writing to him because Jan said, oh, you can just write him. And I sent him a letter and asking him about, you know, an ethnopoetic detail in my analysis. And he wrote me back actually 1 page on the answer to the detail and 19 pages on sort of why I had to become an anthropologist. And many students say that to me after I'm sort of involved in class with them, that, you know, that they want more of that, you know, that they want more. And I wrote a small poetry piece with you, Áine, and I can quickly share that. When I was teaching in Groningen just now, I was expected to fulfill a specific role. I was expected to know about gender. Gender is social class. I started to talk about Marx. The student wanted more Blommaert, more Blommaert, more Blommaert, more Marx. I couldn't give them that from the direction on. More business, they said. You need to teach more business. More business. You cannot understand gender if you do not understand social class, and so on. The poem goes on for that a little bit. But the point is that, you know, we should give them more and less of capitalism, I think, and give them more of a sort of sharing, give them more teachings that have a real sense to their life, that speak to them, and start from the life world in which they are used to sort of connecting with which they are supposed to connect with, and so on. So that's what Jan did very well. That's what Jan did very well.
I think that you really conveyed a sense of reverence and the generosity of spirit and humility that, you know, I think it is something that we all would hope to emulate, try to. And you've just you referred to that to the poem in which you say you cannot understand gender if you don't understand class, and something in your in what you've just read to us in your presentation as well. You talked about experiencing collision with different conventions when you tried to teach gender studies from a Marxist perspective, and I'd just love to hear why you think that is the way to approach it.
Yeah, I think first of all, gender as a category holds together with many other categories, and I think we should study it as a whole. I think it's very important, also not only in the classroom, but also for a unified struggle. And that's the thing that often intersectionality lacks, is that, of course, we have rightfully so all these different categories piled on top of each other, all with their different struggles and, you know, all their different problems and issues, which of course we are worth fighting for and which we should fight for. But sometimes by doing these separate categories, and not seeing them as linked together, we often forget about the unification of the struggle, which ultimately comes down to the fact that there is not a possibility for a lot of change under this current system, under the current education system, under the current system that oppresses women, that oppresses immigrants, and so on. So I think that to unify the struggle would make also our teaching much stronger, and teaching from that perspective, which basically is a struggle and a perspective that goes against capitalism, which basically lets us see an alternative for Tina. Tina, the 1970s, 1980s slogan, "There is no alternative." And a lot of us have grown up in times when the Berlin Wall has fallen down, when China is basically market capitalism, North Korea is completely out of line. We still have some sort of different system in Cuba, but it's all watered down and it's all sort of an old world, and even though there were many different problems in all those different world systems, we still could see at one point an alternative for capitalism. And I think that nowadays it is very difficult to see that alternative. And also in our teaching, we can often not see beyond the fact that there is one issue that we're dealing with, or one issue that we're involved in. And it also goes back to Worf, our good friend Benjamin Lee Worf, the linguistic anthropologist, who said, the Sapir-Whorf thesis up with his good friend Edward Sapir, about the fact that language actually forgoes thought. So gender and all these other categories are constructs in language. And so these discursive constructs also hang together really closely and are produced in and by language. And therefore, it is very important how we teach, the kind of language that we use, the way we construct carefully these frameworks. And, in some senses, in my last engagement, so to speak, I wasn't really able to bring that out. I would need a couple of classes to sketch that framework. I can't do that in a couple of minutes, and so for the students it was very, very hard that we had to move on because they needed more business texts, and I was just pressing on with we need more. They were pressing on to me with we need more Marx, more Blommaert, and so I wasn't able to give that to them at that point, but maybe later on.
Before I open the floor to other questions, and other points for discussion, I think that another thing that really struck me was when you said that you speak not to power. You quoted Jan Blommaert, and I speak not to power, but in defiance of it. And I think that is reflected in the choice of form that you've used to give your presentation today. That choice of form in itself is an act of resistance, and not only have you chosen poetry but reggae, and perhaps you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think first of all, reggae was one of Jan's favorite genres. And I remember we danced at my PhD defense to a nice, we had a nice reggae party, and it was a lot of fun. But it's all about voice, I think. Voice is having the capacity to be heard and understood on your own terms. And a lot of us are good at certain genres. We're good at poetry or playwriting or academic writing, or we're good at, at rap or at whatever comes to mind. And, those kinds of genres should get more attention within the academy. And I think bringing alternative voices to the fore by using these different, more revolutionary types of forms would definitely bring about a little bit of change in that sort of what sometimes is seen as a hermetic world. And a lot of people have already tried this and are doing this and are really successful at this. So I'm hopeful that, and also to go back to Worf once again, form here really underscores function. So the words can be powerful when spoken in a certain form. The words can be powerful when spoken in a certain poetic form, for instance. That's what you also see in the type of analysis which is called ethnopoetics, in which you sort of look at the form of someone's speech and try to see how the form really underscores the function. And this is something that Jan also in his life really much stressed on, is the sort of relativity of form and function, so that you sort of have this idea of something that can have one different form, can have very many different functions in the whole world. A newspaper in Tanzania can be used completely different from a newspaper in Belgium, for instance. So the similar form can have very different functions. And here you see that poetry can definitely, bring to the fore words and utterances that cannot be spoken otherwise, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what draws me to Jan's work, and also to yours, that preoccupation with the idea that that we need to respond to the issue that if you don't speak right in a particular way, then you're not heard, and what happens to those voices then, and what do we miss when we don't hear them? So yeah, just thank you very much again.
My pleasure.
It was inspirational. Do we have any questions or comments from the floor at this point?
I think Lode wants to ask something.
Oh, yes, please do.
Okay,
Lode?
thanks. Just a small question, building on your line of reasoning. You just mentioned, Jenny, would you say that in the academic world, we're stuck in the same form over and over again, and we should try to get out of that by, for instance, producing more monologues and more poems like you just did?
Yeah, I'm currently involved. Thank you so much for that question, Lode. I'm currently involved with one of my MA students in a research project on menstruation poverty, and the fact that young girls are unable to, buy menstruation products of all kinds, and that they're too expensive and so on. And we're actually so interviewing some of the girls and rendering their voices poetic. So we're using the voices of the girls to sort of speak to us in a poetic way, and we're capturing that in poetry. But we're also currently working on doing the methodology in poetic form. So I've recently presented in another workshop where poetry is sort of used as a research means. And this is also a venue where that often happens. I've discussed a poem by myself, which is basically rendering Goffman's work into poetic form, and so that the methodology also becomes a poem almost. So we're gonna push for that MA thesis to be put forward in poetry, and sort of have both the methodology and the. So I think in that sense, form really is an important aspect of what we're doing, and the kind of form that we use as academics is at the kind of form that is readable for people at the pinnacle of society, people at the pinnacle of knowledge and so a democratic knowledge sharing is also involved when rendering things poetic and letting people be heard on their own terms. And what we plan to do is also bring the poems back to the girls and sort of speak with them, and let them see themselves within the poetry, and sort of have them comment on it, and maybe laugh with it, joke with it, change it, and so in that sense, you really bring back knowledge from what you've recorded through a sort of poetic mill, and you bring it back to the people that you were involved with. So I think all those things go together. I think that the form in which you present things also can make it more democratic, and that it immediately has an influence on bringing back the people into the research as well. And that's very difficult with a paper. If I would write a highly skilled academic paper, and I would bring that back to informants, they would barely recognize themselves. And I've had someone say, when I read your paper, Jenny, it was like I was looking into a broken up mirror. So looking into something that, was sort of, and that doesn't exclude us from writing academic papers. It's not one or the other. It's just, we can do both.
Thank you for that question. And if are there any other questions either in response to that or on any separate points from the floor? Otherwise, I'd like to just open the discussion a little bit about, you've talked about form, poetic form, Jenny, but of course, and the fact that it's not either or, and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, conventional academic form and poetic form. But I also think it's interesting to think about and talk about using a poetic lens for analysis. And of course, that does not absent rigor and attention, and so what's to be gained from using an applied ethnopoetic lens in analysis, and how it requires you know, an extreme attentiveness.
Yeah, I think we should be extremely attentive to that detail that, you know, the informants that we work with, the people that we work with are speaking and listening with love. We need to listen with a big heart. We need to listen to all the details and bring out the details in a very good transcription. Transcribing is not something, I often am surprised when people are outsourcing their transcription practices. I understand that. I mean, I've done it before myself, but I had a big corpus and so on. But actually, it's pretty strange if you think about it, because it is us outsourcing this to someone who hasn't heard the people speak the words. And so how can you bring in the kind of voice, the kind of words, the kind of heart that was spoken within that poetic form, when you haven't transcribed it yourself? So doing a very good transcription is, first of all, doing justice and honor to the kind of words that were spoken. And then I think doing a poetic analysis brings issues of voice to the forefront, as I mentioned earlier. It makes sure that people are heard on their own terms, that things that are being missed often are being recognized. I once did research with social workers in Antwerp for 6 years, and we actually noticed that there was a lot of narrative, what one would say, for example, in intake conversations, a lot of narrative packing. So people were trying to quickly wrap up, so to narratively pack the story for the next person in the line, that was social worker 2, and then they had to pack it for social worker 3. You know, narratively sort of make it into a small piece. And by doing that, they actually missed several really interesting and really important stories that people were about to tell, that they were bursting out to tell, but that weren't told because the space was not given by the social worker in question for the client to tell the story. So they often miss narrative opportunities. And by doing an ethnopoetic analysis, we were able to bring to the forefront the type of analyses in social work that I really think we need, that sort of see here the speaker, the client, was trying to bring in a story and we might have missed it. You know, and so we looked at these narrative moments, these narrative possibilities with social workers, and we actually developed the narrative protocol so that, you know, they could better pay attention to the kind of stories that were missed, you know, or the kind of information that would have been missed. So that, in that sense, you know, the narrative genre is the interview genre by which people are often taken along. Like, for example, with the intake interview, is a very specific genre, and you only do it perhaps once in your life. So, and immediately people have to be able to be in the right genre. It's like doing a PhD defense. Either you hit or you miss. So with an intake interview, you sort of immediately, it has to go well. And the standard is immediately set. If I take you in, if you're a client, Áine, I would say your name is McAllister Áine. I would start with your last name, which immediately sets the frame for the formality of the whole thing. So people have to be capable to talk within the genre, to be capable to bring their story in, to bring it in at the right time, for it not to be missed by a social worker. So it's very difficult for the client and for the social worker to discursively produce appropriate knowledge to sort of bring this further, you know, bring the process of intake further, to give the appropriate care, maybe psychological care. Maybe there's people who are being abused, which needs to be taken care of before they can live on their own, you know. And so all these things, that's what ethnopoetics can do. Yeah.
I read something this morning at the moment in the UK, the proposed Borders and Nationality Bill is being discussed, and I think I've written down something that a baroness said, that some people may simply not know the right language, so it speaks to what you were just talking about. In other words, they don't know what's being asked of them, and so the system presumes then that failures of language indicate deceit.
Yes.
So I think that's another, that's another implication for considering the poetic lens and applied ethnopoetic analysis, and really carefully considering the framework that we use to assess people's truths.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's an epistemology. People speak in a certain epistemology, and when we're not part of that epistemology, we cannot understand them properly. If you see an asylum interview, for example, it is the epistemology of very quick succession of question and answers. Are you from there? Can you name the last presidents of Burkina Faso? Can you produce this information? So it's a very quick succession of question and answers in an epistemology which is truth-seeking, which wants to have a yes or a no. And within the epistemology of the asylum seeker, this is a very different epistemology in which one wants to maybe bring stories in, bring experience in. And so these epistemologies often clash and are, sort of.
And that's where voice is lost systematically.
Where voice is lost, yes. Yes, exactly. And that is where ethnopoetics, which we also did with asylum seekers and asylum commissars, we made transcriptions of these missed opportunities and of these epistemologies. And so then show them to asylum commissars to see where they had missed opportunities. And that work has been ongoing and is still done by Catherine Marijns, who is a very good cooperator also of Jan Blommaert, and who works on asylum court cases. So the work has been picked up by lots of people. So that's a good idea. Jan may be gone, but he said, don't look at me, look at what's behind me, what's beyond me. And so that's what we are supposed to do, I think.
Yeah, and that's what you are doing. Thank you. Do we have any further questions? Or Jenny, are there any particular parts of your monologue that you would like to draw attention to, or to point out with regards to what it was that you thought was important to say?
Yeah, the most important thing to say, I think, is the fact that when someone is gone, it doesn't mean their work is gone. And we have everything we have. And we shouldn't go look in corners and details, because for Jan, everything is open access on the internet. The publishers often didn't like that he would publish a book beforehand, so and then have it published one day later by the publisher, and would have it entirely available in free format the day before. So I'm very weary of that myself, but I do it myself to make it available, to make it to be generous about things. I think that's what I wanted to convey today.
Okay, yeah, and I think you really, that was very clearly conveyed in the when you were talking about teaching.
Do you have a minute? There's been someone at my door for like 3 times calling already. Let me just get back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Just a second. Do we have any other voices? Any other points that we'd like to discuss regarding Jenny's wonderful presentation, wonderful monologue?
I would like to make a short intervention, if possible.
Yes, please.
I'm so sorry about that.
I don't know. Wait, do you see my video? No.
No, we can't see it.
Wait, okay. Yeah, it's a
We
bit
can now,
dark here.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I would like to bring up a memory to Jan and a call. In fact, I think the first time as a then young student, I heard Jan's name was in 1992, when together with Jeff Verschuren, he wrote a book on the migration debate in Belgium after the first big victory of the far right of Vlaams Belang. And at that moment, the book was really influential in the debates. and helped also building the anti-racist movement. So I think as you know, we're still confronted with that far-right party, and which only became stronger through the years. And I think it's really important that intellectuals, academics, again, make this kind of activist and academic intervention, because there was a lot of thinking behind the book, and Jan, but also Jeff Verschuren, they didn't hesitate to go to debates all through the country for months on end. So I really think, Jenny, of course, she talked a lot about it, but it's really a call. We need this. We need this also in social movements, among activists. We need this kind of interventions, and on that level, someone like him will be sorely missed. That's for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think, you know, the book that you mentioned was an extremely important book, and it should be translated in English urgently.
It's a good. The good news is that it has been
re-edited. Yes.
Yeah, re-edited.
So
it's already a big thing in Flanders to get your book re-edited especially after 30 years.
When I break my leg the next time, I will translate it.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions for Jenny? Okay, I think I'd like to thank you all. Jenny, if you have any closing comments.
I want to thank everyone for coming out. This has been really, really, really a pleasure to do this, to make this, to fabricate this, and to find the creative venue that is interested in it. So thank you also, Áine. Thank you for giving this opportunity, and yeah, see you all soon in other constellations.